Okay. How's the volume? Welcome, everyone, to Montreal. How many people are a bit jet lagged? I know I am. Who got in here yesterday? Everyone? Okay, that's a little bit better. So to start off with, I'd just like to get a show of hands. From the survey I sent out before the tutorial, it looked like this group is skewed towards the lower end of the experience spectrum, so I geared things to that, which may disappoint some of you until I get to the next part. So to compensate for some of that, I decided to split the tutorial into kind of two sections. One is more of a walkthrough of a lot of the beginning to intermediate features of how to use the admin, and then we'll split up into solo or groups with the remaining time. And I have a couple of example projects that are a little bit more interesting if you go through the admin reference doc, and people can pick what they would like to work on and then explain their approaches. So we'll have a guided walkthrough, and then we'll have a bit of a more hands-on approach where I'll be walking around the room. My name is Jacinda, as you all already know. I've been working with Python for about 7 years now, and with Django in particular for really extensively the last 2.5 years, although I first started working with it about 3 years ago. The reason I got interested in the admin was at my own company, we started using it more and more, and it was always this question of, do you go on and build your more, do you go build a whole custom admin or use one of the frameworks, or do you use the functionality that already exists within Django and extend it? It turns out that there's an awful lot you can do before you have to go use a custom framework. Some of it may or may not be pretty, but it can be useful if you're trying to get around. The structure of the tutorial, as I mentioned, is guided walkthrough. We'll go through this repository step by step. I'll show you some considerations as you're setting up an admin. Next, we'll go over a bunch of the more common settings that you can use with the admin that aren't included in the walkthrough. I'll suggest some example projects, and people will work together to come up with a project and show it off. I also, for those of you who did fill out the survey, I have way more candy here than I know what to do with. Periodically, to kind of break things up, I'll have people introduce themselves, about 5 at a time. When I've done this kind of tutorial before, having everyone try and introduce themselves at once before the tutorial starts ends up taking way too long, but it is kind of a nice breakup to have everyone say a little bit about themselves and why they're here. Last thing before I get started, how many people in the room have been working with Django for less than a year? Yeah. How many people have been working with Django for more than a year? More than 2 years? More than 3 years? All right. For each of you that had more than 3 years, how long have you been working with Django? 7? Okay. Let's get started then. This is the repository that you all have access to. I am running myself the version of just using the standard development server. So we have on here, we'll be able to see all of the diffs, and on this screen here, we'll be able to see the admin as it changes. So here we didn't do anything particularly special, just set up Django using the default start project values, include admin.sites.url, and go from there. Yes.
Are you assuming that we've executed this already?
I am not necessarily assuming that you've executed anything.
Okay, good.
And
That would be incorrect.
you don't need to execute anything at this point, to be clear. And the way that this will work is we'll go through commit by commit, and I'll basically be going back and forth between checking out commits and moving over here to show you the ramifications of what I'm doing. So the first thing that people often want to do is use the users app. There are a couple of interesting ramifications in terms of how you can do this. The way that I frequently like to work with this is to subclass abstract user. And I like to for this tutorial because it helps demonstrate a number of different qualities of where you can get things in the admin. One of the important points about the admin is that the admin is not magic. The admin is a Django app like any other Django app. That's one of the reasons that I like working with it so much is in some other frameworks, sometimes things that are built in feel a little bit different and you're not sure how they work because they don't necessarily play by the rules. Django's admin is not like that. Django plays by the rules, and all of the code that you'll read in the admin itself, for the most part, plays by all the same rules that you're used to seeing in your own custom apps. So, to start here, we have an abstract user that we're going to call our library user. Stepping back a little bit, the whole way that we work through this tutorial is in the context of a library, where we'll have users of the library who can be either librarians or patrons, people checking out books. We'll have items, which we just have a single subclass of an abstract item, which is book, and authors. And with this, we're able to demonstrate most of the core features of the Django admin. So, with our library user, we have all of the default admin fields, or all of the default user fields that are here. What we wanted to do is add a birth date field because, for example, we may want to in the future restrict who can check out certain kinds of materials based on age. So you don't want a 6-year-old checking out certain books or DVDs or things like that. And gender. Gender we didn't really have to add, but it's good for an example. In settings, in order to tell Django to use this user instead of the default user, we set auth user model to be this particular user, and we do this before we've created any migrations or run any migrations. Otherwise, you'll have problems trying to migrate it later. We added it to our list of installed apps and go from there. Add the migration. And some of the things that I've already done, for example, are in the admin. I've already created a super user and a bunch of example data, and there's a script in there that will generate a bunch of fake random data for you as well if you need it. This is what we get without having added anything. So, yes. Indeed. And at any point, stop me if you have questions.
Actually,
Yes?
I do have a question. So these library
They would log in through the standard Django interface. You can customize the standard Django interface by overriding templates, so that's one of the things we'll get to in just a second. The Django tutorial actually shows you one way to do that. We'll do it here as well. One of the things that's important to note on that with regard to the admin is, who is the admin for? Anyone? Yes?
The admin person responsible for the site maybe, or worker.
So in this case, we would only have librarians logging in to the admin interface. We would most likely have a separate site for people who are browsing books or looking up books that would be designed for them. The admin in this case is a way for the librarians, who are our staff users, to modify books, potentially check out books to users, do things that are involved in the management of the library's inventory. Whereas you probably wouldn't want to expose this to your general users. You could, and I've definitely seen people do that, where you take the admin and you try and make it into a fully fleshed site, and you do all sorts of horrible things. But in general, you want to have a clear distinction between people who are managing your data, that's who the admin is for, and people who are using the site. So we added auth user model. And if any of you have I'm sure most of you have set up a default project before. Normally you have a users group here as well, don't you? So why isn't it here? So Django may someday be able to pick up the fact that the auth user model setting is here and use the user and use that for user here, but right now it doesn't. It would also be kind of tricky because when you use the abstract user this way, you are adding a bunch of other fields, but our next step is to fix that. Sorry, my mouse is misbehaving. Well, our next step before this is this line here. So most of you are used to seeing admin, include admin.site.urls. Why might it be a bad idea to use /admin on a production site? Yes? And even if they don't know that your site is using Django, if they happen to go to /admin and see the login, then they will know that your site is using Django. And if there are any vulnerabilities, or if you're running on an insecure version of Django, then they may be able to exploit that. So security through obscurity is not a good thing, but it is one aspect of defense in depth. So anytime you're setting up a production site, you generally want to change this admin URL to be something else. So if we go here, we'll notice that this no longer works. Go to libadmin, works. Now, we mentioned before that seeing Django administration is perhaps not the most user-friendly. If I was a librarian logging in, I might be confused as to what is this Django thing? Nobody told me I was using Django. What do I do now? And there are a couple of different ways to change this. So we're going to go through both of them. And before we do that, let's pause and have the first row introduce themselves. and your name, and state your favorite type of candy, and I'll toss it your way. So right to left.
Howard, Howard Himovich. I live about 120 miles from here. I was a founder developer, not so much work anymore. So I've decided to go with Django and Python.
Hmm.
And I hired a tutor, and I've been working very hard for the last month to catch up. Because I really am an expert founder. I want to become an expert now in Django. And I worked on registration, like what you're doing.
Mhm.
So I feel at home here.
Awesome.
Mark Smershek, Kansas City. Primarily most of my career I did C++ and converted over to internal tools for our company, learned Python and Django, and that's pretty fun.
I'm Gavin Hurley. I live in the Washington, D.C. area, and I've always been a .NET developer and using Python for fun until January 1st,
Okay.
when I got to go and mentor computer science students at the University of Maryland, College Park, in .NET and Python development. So I'm now trying to put my money where my mouth is.
I'm Serge from Nexus. Actually, I didn't use Django a lot, but I wanted to use that at full speed with Django. I mean, I saw it like wizard, and you can easily create stuff. And one just not be create stuff. Hello, my name is Jason, and I've been working with Python for a few years now. Mainly interested in the science and computing aspect. I work for Bank of America on a course project doing FX. My favorite candy would be Baker's Mark.
Okay. That's one that I didn't have. I only have candy from people who replied before, I think, April 3rd. But we have tons of extra.
Hello, I'm Jordi, work for Howard Hughes Medical Institute in Cherry Chase, Maryland. We use Django for a write-back capability using Tableau software. I'm hoping to use more Django for other web applications we can do in the market.
All right. And I didn't mention, I work for a company called Doctor On Demand that builds a telemedicine app that allows people to have a video call with a doctor. I was the first engineer there, and we build our entire backend using Python and Django. All right, moving on. First way to update the admin is to overwrite the template. So in this case, there is a template directory called basesite.html. I actually have a handy guide to the various admin templates within Django. It may be hard to read. I can send this out tomorrow as an extension, but basically you can see the way that the Django admin sources its templates is you have base.html, basesite.html, which is where you have the main login and the main background. You have your 404 and 500 pages, your index and your app index, which is where you have the listing of all of the different apps that are auto-discovered by the admin, unless you override app index, in which case you can do whatever you want. If you start doing that, you're well on your way, by the way, to just developing your own custom admin site. Login, and then the main ones here that are really interesting are change form, which is where we'll get to whenever you see an edit view, and in many cases an add view, it's looking at change form. Change list is when you see the list of all of the objects that you have in the admin. And object history is when you're about to delete something. It'll show up there. Or sorry, delete confirmation is where it shows that. Object history is that little history button that you have in the top right corner. So now we change that, but nothing changed. What did we forget to do?
Restart the website.
No, the dev server automatically restarts every time we change the text file change. Yes, I don't know of a good way to make this bigger, but what we changed is templates/admin/base-site.html.
Right, what did you change over?
Oh, the default value for this is, pull up the code. So we're going to go into Django. Contrib, admin, templates, admin. So I wanted to figure out how to change that base site. So what I did here, and I can make this bigger as well.
Is it a thing of migrate?
It's not a thing of migrate. This is an existing template that Django knows how to find. What we forgot to do is we haven't yet added this to the list of directories that Django searches. So what we need to do is go back to our settings file and add our custom template directory. Note here, and the reason I wanted to call this out is for anyone who's been using Django pre-1.8, this is something that changed in Django 1.8. So you can see here this templates list which is now a list of the different template engines that you want to use. This backend is the default Django template backend. Previously, you would have changed a setting called template_ders. This is no longer the case in 1.8, so something to look out for. You instead need to change the DIRS field in this dictionary. So now if we restart, we can see that this title that we changed here to Little Library Admin is showing up correctly. I said that was one way to change this. Django 1.7, I believe, actually added a different way of doing this because it seems a bit like overkill to override the entire template just to change the title for the admin. So there's actually an easier way to do it now, where we can do it just with one line. So skipping ahead a little bit, if we go into our PyCon library/URLs file, down at the bottom, we can now change the admin site title by changing admin.site.site title to whatever we want it to be. Side note, there's actually a third way to do it that is the way that the tutorial mentions, but which I think is actually overkill. So if you, yes?
I'm sorry, you might have gotten a little ahead of me, and I'm willing to wait.
All right.
But you're editing the source file, right? The actual HTML templates
Mhm.
that the admin system's going to use. Now, when I use Django admin start project,
Yes.
and it creates a template for me that includes the admin stuff,
Mhm.
where are those files? Because I'm trying to find the files that you're editing, and they're not going to be in my code directory, are they?
The files that I'm editing are actually going to be in your code directory. So the way that Django templates allow you to work is the default templates are in Django. So if you went to Start Project,
That's where I thought they were, but you're not editing those.
No.
right?
Because if you did that, you would have to do something very ugly where you'd be patching Django
Oh, well,
every
it
time you.
would affect every project you work on.
Exactly.
So how did you, and you, I'm sorry, you probably went over this, but how did you tell your project use, you must have copied these.
Hmm.
How did you tell your project to use these instead?
So instead of changing them here, where we have, for example, base site.html, let me make this bigger. This is our repository here. In our PyCon library directory, that's what I added to the DIRS system to tell it to search within
Okay.
PyCon library /
So that's where
directory.
you went and you edited, see, and you're editing in your, see, this confused me too.
Hmm.
You're editing in source tree, so I'm looking at both the old and the new line of code, aren't I?
The red is the old line of code, the green is the new line of code. So this means I deleted this line and added this
That
line.
confused me because I thought that was an editor and there were two entries with the same name.
No, I've done versions of this tutorial before where I try and do the entire thing editing live. It's not a good idea. It works, but it's not a great idea. Yes? Oh, no, I'm not holding out on you. We are getting to the point where we don't need that, actually. So, jumping back a little bit, when I said that it was possible to do it this way, this is the way that if you go to the Django tutorial part 2, where it walks you through the admin, this is exactly what it shows you how to do for the purposes of showing you how to override templates. And that's also why I include it in this tutorial as a review. But this line is what tells Django, okay, so for templates, you're going to use all of your default template directories from all of the apps that you have installed. So for every app that's installed, including the admin app. So if we look at this directory, this last line here, contrib admin. So in our installed apps, we have Django contrib admin. Within each app, Django by default looks for a templates directory. And then you have your admin for namespacing purposes. So when I said this wasn't magic, Django is doing exactly what you would do if you were to create an admin from scratch. And what you can do with any template is you can overwrite it. So what we did here is by adding this templates admin base site.html, instead of using the default one, Django now uses the one that we put in place. The other way that the tutorial mentions that I'm not going to talk about in much detail, but is in the repository history, is most of the time you will likely only need the default Django admin. But if you want to create your own admin site, you can do that and have it inherit from the admin site that Django itself uses. So if we want to take a look at the code here, if we look in models.py, actually, sites.py. At the bottom of sites.py, Django actually defines site to be admin site. I didn't actually have to grep through to find that. You can also find it by looking at your settings file. Or by looking at any file where you end up importing from the admin. And I'll go back to that because at this point where I am in the code, it won't look at that. But what this is doing is saying that when you import django.contrib.site and put that into your list of installed apps, you have django.contrib.admin, and then that's what I wanted. Admin.site.urls. Site is actually an instance of admin site. So if you need to really do everything in a custom way, you can override admin site and have your own custom admin site, which is mentioned in the tutorial. And it actually says that you can create a custom admin site just to replace these three values, which are the site header, the site title, and the index title. They show up on the login page, in the title of the web page, and on the index page when you're going through things. I don't recommend doing it this way because then later on you have to remember to reference your custom admin site, and you don't actually need to, but the option is there. So now we're going to, and this is where, if you noticed, we deleted our templates directory, so that's why you guys couldn't find it anymore, because we don't actually need it. The simplest way to overwrite the site title, site header, and index title is just to do it, for example, at the bottom of urls.py and override the default admin.site.site title. If you create a custom instance, what you're doing is, what you would do instead is my admin site.site title, or like we showed in this example, just in the definition of the class. How are we doing? Keep going? Okay. Now we're getting back to where we couldn't see the library user. I think you're all familiar with how to register a model with the admin, right? This is no different. Let's just try it the easiest way possible first. So we're just going to see what happens when we register our custom user with the admin. Let's log back in. Showed up. Under our library users app, we have users. I've created a couple users already. And with that, let's pause, and second row, your turn. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Should I throw them out to you guys, or would that just cause issues? Ooh, but then we're rewarding sleeping. That doesn't seem like a good idea at all. Okay.
Hi, my name is François Leguy-Legrand from here in Montreal. I'm actually an iOS developer who's looking for back-end solutions.
Mm-hmm.
I'm developing a website for my own purposes with Django, having lots of fun and lots of code.
All right.
And my favorite candy is Skittles.
Yes, I have lots of Skittles.
I'm Jeff Kirk. I'm a senior technical program manager at Google, and
Oh, so you were the one? There were a couple people who were like, my favorite candy is peaches, and I was like, I'm with you. I have to get rid of all of this because I told someone that I wouldn't eat any of it, and I wanna win that bet.
If you have any bacon, I'll take that.
All right.
My name is Jacinda Shelly. I'm from Colorado, from Trinidad, and I'm a PHP developer, but I'm getting into PyCon. We have a admin system for managing our data sources,
Mhm.
and we said put Django on top of that, so I'm learning Django.
All right.
And my favorite is Twix.
Christopher Chapman, I work for Monotype in Boston, working on font testing and development tools, including a font validation tool that runs on a server, which is Django-based. I just first exposure to Django.
All right.
I'm Jason from Texas. Work at a small company where I do full stack development, building Django backend, setting up Elastic servers, Elasticsearch, and I do front end development. I do the front end development with Ember and occasionally jQuery and all that.
So you can do everything.
It seems like that. That's what they're forcing me to do.
Oh, that's always fun. All right, so back to where we were. To recap, we have subclassed abstract user, created a library user that adds a gender and birth date, and we wanted it to show up in the admin, so we just registered it with the admin to see what would happen, and this happened. Those of you who've seen this before, this is not what you're used to seeing. In particular, this looks a bit disturbing, doesn't it? So this is the hash of the password. Yes. This is what's actually stored in the database if you use the default authentication system. The problem with this is, what do you think happens if I change this to say hello and save it? Bad things like what? Let's do. I would. I'm no longer logged in. If I try and use my old password, if I try hello, obviously it's not going to work because it's hashing it and then not getting what it expects. So what I will quickly perform surgery to repair this. I know one person asked about how to change things at the command line. That's our staff user. And now I can get back in. So let's fix that. When the, yes? Mm-hmm. Oh, you probably have the old version of the code that was listed in from an older version of the tutorial that I did last year. This is, yes, yes, that will not work. Go here real quick. Have you got that?
No, sorry.
Yes, I sent out a note earlier this morning. Not everyone may have gotten it, but you just need Django 1.8, Django debug toolbar, and that should be it for just following along. And I've been adapting that older version to this. So that's why I haven't sent out the link to this until right beforehand. So let's try something new. So obviously, when you use the default user, you have some much nicer looking fields, right? You have a set password module. Your groups don't look like this. Your user permissions are more nicely formatted. You have some field sets. This is just what the Django admin displays by default. So where might we find the admin that Django uses by default with the default auth user? Remember I said Django doesn't do anything magic. No. So if we're curious, let's take a look in our settings.py file. We have this installed app called django.contrib.auth. That is where we get the default user and group permissions, passwords. Now, it's here in contrib alongside the admin. So you might expect that the auth app uses the admin app, which it does. So you can actually go into the code here, find that, lo and behold, Django creates a user admin that it registers with the default auth user. Who would have thought? So what can we do to take advantage of this now? Yes. So that's what we do in the very next
If I can ask
commit.
a question.
Mhm.
Is there a base user model or base user class? Like is it the abstract user?
The abstract user is what we're inheriting from, and you can find that in models.py.
Does that inherit from anything else?
It inherits from abstract, oops, I can't spell. So it inherits from abstract base user with the permissions mix-in.
Okay.
So this is just going into auth/models.py. This allows us to implement a fully featured user model and just add a couple of extra fields pretty easily. The other way you can do this, if you just use the default user model, is to create another user model, like librarian, and have that subclass user. So then you have a implicit one-to-one relationship between the two. I like to use abstract user as a teaching tool, and it's also useful if you only have a couple of additional requirements for your user model and not a lot of different kinds of users. Or what I've also done is subclass abstract user, put things that you have in common on all users on there, like if your user model requires having a birthday, which is fairly common, or a gender, subclass abstract user, add those fields like we did here, and then subclass that class to create another type of user. So in our case, we could subclass our library user to create a librarian, or we could subclass our library user to create a patron, and those might have special fields, permissions. In fact, that's one of the suggested exercises for the hands-on part. Yes?
Would it be better to just create like a profile model, and that way you wouldn't have to actually modify the user, and you could then just do whatever you want?
There are different schools of thought on it. So pre-Django 1.5, you were required to do exactly what you're saying. The user was difficult to subclass in a reasonable way. Django 1.5 and later introduced an abstract user as well as an abstract base user that allows you to subclass them if it's going to make your life easier. So it's on a per project basis. What I was just talking about, where you might have a librarian user or a user that subclasses our custom user, is exactly the same as creating a user profile, just one level removed. So it's really up to you based on the design constraints of your particular website. So yes, no magic here. This is the class that we're subclassing to get our abstract user. The actual default user is here. Subclasses, abstract user, and no magic. So we subclassed user admin. So we found that the auth app was using a user admin model. Now we just subclass that and we'll see what happens. Note that when we just had the default behavior of registering our custom user model without modifying anything, we have date of birth and gender here. In a minute, you'll see why that's important. Okay, so this is probably what you're more used to seeing. We have our username, our password, personal info, permissions, groups, user permissions, important dates. Something's missing. Gender and birth date. So when we subclassed user admin, we got everything that comes with it. So it defines specific field sets and doesn't know about our custom fields. So we're gonna have to do something to fix that. Side note, Django 1.7 plus has a different way, an optional way to register your model with an admin model. You can do it as a decorator. So what I did in this commit is we removed this admin.site.register call and replace it with this decorator here. I like it better. It may or may not be a matter of personal preference. I think it makes it cleaner in general because it keeps everything together. And you almost always are going to, if you're creating a custom user admin class, there's not much point to it unless you register it. So now we need to make the user admin aware of our custom fields. This is where it may start to look a little bit more interesting. For everyone who's worked with the admin already, how many of you are used to just adding like fields equal, right? You can do something a little bit more custom by using get field sets. So this is where, say your parent does most of what you want it to do, but it's missing a couple of fields like ours is. You can call get field sets, get the field sets, and this is actually broken. We'll get to that in a second. But, you know, we might think this is going to do what we want it to do. Take our current field sets and add custom fields. And yes, it does what we want it to do, to a certain extent. The issue comes, actually I'm going to back up a second and show you how we're going to add a new, sorry, it takes the server repair. There it goes. Occasionally the dev server takes a little bit longer to load. So I was going to add a new user. Example. Got this new user successfully added. But it's missing our custom fields. And this is what was supposed to happen on the previous. It needed to be, the server needed to be reloaded. I'm not sure why it didn't the last time. So we thought we were adding, and this allows us to actually add the user. That's why in this case we had blank equal false. Otherwise, it would have complained. So go back here. I'm going to force restart the admin server because I'm not sure it's going to do what I want here. And now if we want to go back and add a user, this is not what we expected, is it? So on the change list, I'll go through that quickly because I may have been going too fast. So if we look at the change list, this does what we wanted to do. We have our custom fields down here at the bottom, date of birth and gender. But if we want to add a new user, we really only want the username and password so we can get up and running with that user, right? So why do we have all of this extra stuff on our add page now? So here, self.getFieldSets has a separate set of add field sets that it returns if there's no object. So one of the interesting things you can do with a lot of these overridden methods, such as getFieldSets, is you'll notice you have getFieldSets, self, request, and obj equal none. You don't know what that obj equal none is for?
Did you pass in a instantiated object?
So
So it'll take the field sets from the object that you pass in, right?
not exactly. What this is doing is if there's an existing object, it gets passed. If it's adding an object, obj will be equal to none. So by default, the default behavior is to add an object. What user admin is doing in the base case is if there's not an object, so if you're adding a new object, it's going to show you just these field sets. So it's just going to show you username, password1, password2. Right? What happened when we subclassed, we didn't do it quite right. we are always returning self.fieldsets plus custom fields, birthday, gender. So we're always going to return all of these field sets, whether we're adding or changing an object. And then we're going to add our custom fields. So we broke the add form by doing this. It's a pretty easy fix. Instead of just completely steamrolling user admin, we do instead, we call the base class, which will then check whether we're adding or subclass, adding or changing the object. And in that case, it will return add field sets before we get to, it will return add field sets here, and then we'll add our custom fields. So in this case, we're assuming that what we want instead is to be able to add a username, password, and say for some reason date of birth and gender were required for the vast majority of users. You can add these just to the add field. This is kind of a useful thing in general for customizing field sets and really customizing anything in the admin. You're going to find that there's a pretty common pattern once you get beyond the default settings where it looks a lot like this. You have get something, a request, an object, and modifying what the base class is doing, or making something custom. We'll actually get to a better, more thorough example of that towards the end of this example. Yes?
Would that include being able to check whether you're adding or editing so that those aren't always there all the time, but only there, say, when you're editing?
Sure. So do you want to try that right now? So what we would do here is we can do if not obj, then we'll just return the defaults here. Else. So in this case, if we're adding a user, so we don't have obj, then we'll just do whatever the base case is. Otherwise, we'll include our custom fields. And if we go back, we should be able to see that's the case. So now we've gotten rid of those custom fields in the add form. If we went back to change a user, the custom fields are there. Yep. Go back to, let me reset stuff here so that so we've gotten through just about everything we can with users. We've seen how you can subclass other admin models. We've seen how you can use get field sets to change field sets on the fly for custom usage. And next we're going to talk about the other models that we have in this example app. And before we get there, we can go through the next row of people, or introductions.
Hi, I'm Carl Anderson. I am a developer for Harbor Networks in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I literally just started doing PyCon about 4 months ago. Changed teams at the office. I've been a PHP developer for years. So now taking the PyCon, moving Django on the team, some class, and my favorite thing is
Cool. I think what we'll do is I'll put the candy up there. People can come get it at the coffee break. All right.
My name's James Ebert. I work for a climate research organization in British Columbia. Been covering Python for years and years. Just fun a little bit.
Mhm.
And primarily, I'm working with the Django for its framework pieces there on that. We've worked a lot on some stuff with Flask recently, trying to kind of capitalize off the module-based method versus components in there.
All right. Very cool. Before we move into the rest of the app, does anyone have any questions so far that we haven't answered? Nope. Okay. All right. So the next step in our project was I created an app called Stacks. So if you're familiar with library terminology, Stacks just means the bookshelves generally. So I'm using it as the name of the app here to reference everything that the library could store. Start app created our, an empty admin file. It created an empty models file, but I filled it in here. Empty views, and I went ahead and created the initial migrations for this. We'll take a moment to step through the current models. So we have a few different things in this app. One, we have an author who has a last name and a first name. We've defined Unicode to be the full name of that author, and full name returns last name, comma, first name. We have an abstract item class where, how many people are familiar with abstract models? Okay, I'll explain a little bit more in depth then. An abstract model is a model that cannot be instantiated on its own. The way we mark that is abstract equal true. Abstract user also is an abstract model. What this is useful for is if you have a collection of fields that are in common amongst a bunch of different models that you're planning to use, you would generally create an abstract model. In the Django docs, they go through the different ways that you can create base models and subclass them. Abstract models are one of the ways, and the use cases for which you would use an abstract model versus proxying or subclassing, where you would create separate tables, are spelled out in the, I believe it's in the model guide, which is one of the first few things that you'll come across after the tutorial, if you look at what to read next. So in this case, we specify that abstract equals true in the meta, that call number and item number have to be unique together, which means that call number is going to be something like the Dewey Decimal System. Item number is if we have a unique, or if we have a book, for example, and you have two of the same book, just having the call number isn't enough. You'll also need an item number to indicate that you have Pride and Prejudice copy 1, Pride and Prejudice copy 2. Borrowing period is our maximum number of days an item can be borrowed. Max renewal count is how many times the item can be renewed. Maximum fine is how much the fine can be at most for that particular item. And authors,
Cents or dollars?
this is dollars and cents. We're using a decimal.
So the default fine is $25?
Yes. you know, no, that's the default maximum fine.
Oh, default max. Oh, I see.
The actual fine, I'll talk about a little bit later. I don't actually create it in this particular walkthrough, but I'll talk about some of the implications. Authors. So what this is you can take an abstract item and subclass it into any number of other items. And these are the things that you think might be in common. Authors may or may not be in common to everything. You could potentially pick a different name, such as contributors, producers, something like that. But the idea behind this abstract model is you would subclass it for a book and then add the additional fields that are unique to a book. Subclass it to create a DVD, add the fields that are unique to a DVD, subclass it to create an MP3 item, any type of item that the library has in its collection, you can subclass and add your unique models. So we do that here with book. There are other fields we could have added, including publisher, publication date, ISBN number, edition, format, etc. I didn't create everything. I just created page count, title, and a daily fine. Really, daily fine should probably be in the abstract item list, or abstract item model. So this is bug. I'll fix that in the next version of this tutorial. Unicode is self.title. And then we have a loaned book, which we will use later. So I'll talk about loaned book once it's going to be a many-to-many, it's going to be what we use as the through model for our many-to-many relationship between a user who's checking out a book and the book itself. Right, so go back to our home page. After we've added this. Obviously there's nothing there yet because we have not yet registered any of our models with the admin. So let's go ahead and do that. Assuming I can pull this back down. So we're going to start just by doing the default registration. Refresh. There we go. We have authors, books, loaned books. Before this tutorial, I created a whole bunch of fake data. So we have 100 authors in here. I created a whole bunch of fake books. There are 400 of them. I used a module called Fake Factory, or a package called Fake Factory. You can see it in the scripts directory of this repository. And we'll have a break in about 5 to 10 minutes. So if you're getting anxious and want to use the bathroom, stretch your legs, that's coming. So all of these are just random, non-real titles. If we click on them, we have default ordering. So this is all in the same order as what you define it as in the model itself by default. Okay. Now, this is useful. It's nice that it's all auto-generated, but it's not really as useful as we'd want. So what are some things that we might want to additionally do in this admin? I can't. Well, maybe we want to check out some books. Maybe this isn't very user-friendly, so as a librarian, I might have come into my office 5 new books, and I need to add them. So I'm going to go in here. mass adding. Only really useful if all of the books, if you get 5 copies of the same book. But yes, you could do mass adding. So I want to add a call number, so 825, item number, borrowing period, max renewal count. I'm a volunteer. And let's say there's another example. I'm a volunteer librarian. Like, I just joined. I don't know what all these fields mean. The head librarian is off, busy, doing something else. And I'm like, borrowing period? Page count, title? Most of these are fairly self-explanatory, but if we go to, for example, the loaned book admin, we try and add a new loaned book, so someone's checking out a book. Book, checkout date, return date. Kind of want to add some explanation to this. Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Exactly. So it's very easy to do all of these things that you've mentioned. The first thing that we might want to do, just as good coding hygiene, is add some help text. Instead of having a bunch of comments in the code that no one can really use, maybe spell out for someone exactly what all of these different things, like the borrowing period. I might be confused what a borrowing period is. So if I go back to stacks, what we've done here is in our stacks/models.py, we've taken advantage of the help text argument to each of our fields. And this is automatically added to the admin. So if you have users, and most of our fields in this particular example are self-explanatory, right? Like, we've all used a library, we know what it means to have a return date, how long it's going to be for something to do. But if you have a more complex model, you probably want to help your users along. I don't know if any of you have ever had the experience of setting up a website and someone be like, so what does this thing do? And they call you up, and every time you onboard someone, you have to tell them where the document is, or this is just a way to make things be self-documenting so that when you have new users to your admin, they can go in here and see, oh, call number is supposed to be a Dewey Decimal or Library of Congress classification. If we have multiple copies of this book, we have a unique identifier for the copy number. How long it can be borrowed before being renewed, how many times it can be renewed. And the rest of it is still self-explanatory. Amount they'll be fined per day for library book. Yes? That, if you notice in the code, this would be better as a callable that automatically gets the next item number. So yes, UUID or auto-incrementing fields would be better. It's just, I'll fix that in the next version of the tutorial. But yes, it would be better that way. So we have help text. Coming next, to give you, I'll let you all take a 10 to 20-minute break. But after the break, we'll go through the rest of the repository, get into a little bit more advanced work, add our, there are a few more basic things to cover in terms of default usage, and then we'll talk a little bit about performance, which I think everyone will find somewhat exciting, and some things to watch out for when you start getting fancy with list display and having more interactive fields and things like that. But let's all take a quick break. Is it time for the break yet, or should be time for the break? At least we're at a good stopping point.
Don't forget
Let's do that now. All right. So we've got Whoppers. I was serious. I got lots of candy. And these are all separated out into different types so that they're easy to find. Milky Way, Snickers, Hershey, Reese's. You should be able to find something that you like, I'm pretty sure. All right, after the break, we will continue, and then we will, once we've finished this, we'll break out into small groups and start working on individual projects. Please take as much as you want. Everyone ready? Whoa. Everyone ready to get started again? All right, so brief recap. We are at the point where we added a new Stacks app with a couple of models to represent authors, books, and loaned books. We registered them with the admin in stacks/admin.py. We went back to our models and added some help text, which the admin automatically picked up on, and added to our change views. And now we're going to go through this part of the tutorial is going to continue to work through these change sets one by one and point out some more basic, some more advanced things that you can do to make the admin more user-friendly. When we get through this, I will put up a list of suggested exercises. I will have some more basic suggested exercises for people who are less familiar with Django and the admin, and I will have more advanced suggestions for people who are looking for something interesting to do to challenge themselves. And then I will be going around and helping individuals. And we'll see how much time we have for that. During that time as well, if you come up with something particularly interesting that we want to share with the whole group, we can do that as well. Sound good? All right. So, this is one of the most basic things that you can do with the admin, is specify which fields you want to have displayed on that change list, or change page, where you actually add or edit a model or an object. A note on preference/potential good practice. Fields is one option. By default, if you do not specify fields, it will just include all of the fields on your model in the order that they are defined on the model. If you noticed in our author model, we defined last name first and then first name. So before I check out that change, if we went to look at a particular author, we'd see the field last name first and then first name, because that's how it's defined in our model. When I check this change out, I am overriding that default. And it's going to take it a second to load, it looks like. There we go. I'm not sure why sometimes it's fast, sometimes it's slow. I'll have to check on that later. But now we have first name first and then last name. Another note here, when we took out our default registration, we have two options for how to register, just as a review. You can do admin.site.register author, comma, author admin, or you can use the decorator that's newly available. Had to fix a bug there. Next up is, fields are the most basic. If you want to put in a little bit more order in your model admin, we have what are called field sets. So in this example, we are modifying the book model admin. And instead of just having a book where it lists all of the fields in order, we've now broken it out into identifying information for the book. So we specify a tuple where we have identifying information and then all of the fields that we want. So title, page count, authors, call number, and item number are underneath identifying information. Loan information, borrowing period, max renewal count, daily fine, maximum fine. And they show up here, as we'd expect. Yes? Hmm? So if you're going to be adding more fields, you will have to change the code in this case. So a tuple is slightly more performant than a list because it is immutable, like you mentioned. So having it as a tuple has a minor performance improvement over using a list. Yes, potentially. On a big site, you'd have all sorts of caching, and it can matter. I think you'll end up with the database mattering a lot more. One other thing to note is we have fields. So you can see there are fields and field sets. There is another option called exclude. So say you had a model that had 100 fields and you wanted to display all of them in your change form except for 2 of them. Instead of specifying 98 fields and leaving out the 2 you don't want, you can use exclude, and it will include all of the fields that are not in the exclude list. In general, unless you have an absurd number of fields, I personally consider it better practice to always explicitly specify fields, and to get into the habit of doing that for 2 reasons. 1, explicit is better than implicit. And 2, if someone is new to your code base and adds a potentially insecure field, if you're using exclude, it's going to show up by default. If you specify the fields, then it won't show up unless they explicitly add it. This part of the tutorial may go a bit faster because what I'm going through here is in the Django docs, there's a model reference, an admin reference document that feels essentially like a list of all of the possible things that you could do on an admin, because that's what it is. I think printed, it's like 40 pages. So this is just a highlight. They do include a lot of examples and everything, but it's still, it gives you a sense for how much of a batteries included feature the admin actually is and how much depth there is to it. It's a pretty substantial app. Filter horizontal. Actually, let me go back to first to demonstrate what this currently looks like. Here we have authors. Right now we have the default many-to-many widget, which allows us to inconveniently scroll through everything and try to see which authors are associated with this model. It's not ideal. So for most many-to-many fields, I definitely recommend using filter horizontal or filter vertical. What this does is that's what gives you the widget that allows you to filter. So if I was going to look for Turner, I can command select and add 2 more authors. I can remove all of the authors. Yes? Yes, when you get to the point that you have, say, depending on your database and your server, tens of thousands of foreign keys, this is going to get slower, but not, depending on how it's implemented, not necessarily hugely slow. Yes. There is a solution. Mhm. So I'll touch on this briefly. So yes, there is a limit to where it gets slow that is dependent on your site. To solve that problem, a couple of approaches that I'll mention include, there are some other widgets out there that allow you to do a search and autocomplete, so it won't actually do the whole lookup until you're searching for it. Other options include overwriting this particular widget and filtering before you get to this point. So let me try and give an example of that. Touch base with me when we get to the individual point, because I have an example of that that's a little bit more advanced, where instead of getting all of the possible authors, if you know that in general you only need a small subset of them, it will do that. You could. That's more advanced, but yes, anything's possible. That's not something that you can do just by adding a single line of code like we did here. Yes.
Actually, kind of building upon the stuff, right? From performance issues, or you want user, customizable choices. At what point do you want to not go with the built-in admin tools
Mm-hmm.
and instead start rolling your own custom admin interface?
I would say at the point, there are probably two points. One is if your users of the admin are not really people who are managing data. They're using it as like a view to see what's in the data. There are ways that you can make that pretty easy in the admin, and I actually talk about that later on. And really, once it becomes unmanageable, and I think a good rule of thumb is to imagine if you had a new person coming on your project, would you have to give them as much training on the customizations that you've done to the Django admin as you would have to on a from-scratch Django website?
You mean from like a developer view?
From a developer viewpoint. From an end user standpoint, there are enough tricks performance-wise that you can generally go for a long time without needing to switch away from the default admin, to the point where you can have hundreds of thousands or millions of rows, and as long as you do it in a smart way and take advantage of some features that I'm going to show at the end of this change set, you can make it work. And as long as you have reasonably fast servers. But I think your biggest component is developer time in this case. So, good rule of thumb, if you are having to train your new developers, on all of the customizations that you've made to the Django admin as much as you would have to train them on a from scratch site, you're getting to that point, or maybe like 75%. Then you'll get more out of doing something custom. But not much custom is going to be able to give you one line of code and have nice widgets like this. So I can save this. I can show. Now when I add a new object, it includes this. I can also, there's filter horizontal. I'll show you briefly what filter vertical looks like. And for those of you who are following along who want to know where everything is in the repository, so right now we're looking at stacks, admin.py, inside of the PyCon library repository. So we change this to be vertical. Come on. Then it shows you a different widget that behaves in the same way, except it's top and bottom. I personally prefer horizontal, but depending on your aspect ratio, your mileage may vary. Next up, moving ahead, I mentioned that loaned books was a through model for a many-to-many relationship between a library user who's checking out a book and books. So in this commit, we add that in library users/models.py. So we're adding a new field to the library user. Migrate that and move ahead. For those of you who have less experience with Django, who knows the difference between what happens with null equals true and blank equals true? Yes? Right. So right here, I have, on this change set that we're on, if I take a look at admin.py and oops, models.py on the right-hand side, and look at return date, see that we have null equal true. This is just a quick aside. Go back to our set of loaned books. Take a look at this one. There's no return date, which is allowed at the database level, but at the form level, it's going to error out on me. So I can add blank equals true. And it's just where the validation happens. And now it should not error out on me. Because it doesn't really make sense to have a return date before the book is actually returned. Next up for the list of basic features is inlines. So if we take a look at our library users, now that we've added that list of loaned books, it might be nice to be able to see all of the books that someone has checked out on their profile. The way that you would typically do this is to add an inline field. This also allows you to check out a book for a user from that user's profile. This is one of the things that's covered in the Django tutorial part 2 as well, so I won't go into it in too much depth, but what you do is, in this case, we have two pieces. We have stack/admin.py, which is where we'll define the loaned book inline. And we'll call it a tabular inline. There's another type of inline called a stacked inline that just looks different. The model that it's based on is our loaned book model, and extra specifies how many more objects underneath you can add at a time. In library users, we specify that we want to see this inline on the library user admin. Let's take a look at what this does to our library user that we know has books checked out. It's unhappy. Why is it unhappy? Next time I'm using Apache. Go down and we see that this user has 4 books currently on loan, when they were checked out, when they're due, when they were returned, how many times they've been renewed, whether or not they've paid any fines. And here we can inline add another loaned book just by filling out these fields and saving. So say I wanted to check out this book today. I could do 10 days from now. Save it. Do it all from their user profile. Depending on how many books they have checked out, this could also cause performance issues if you have something like thousands of books checked out, or even on the development server. I think that's why this particular page is starting to have issues. We'll also get to some basic debugging, where I'll show you an easy way that you can see where things might be causing a bottleneck. So that's basic inlines. I'll pause for a second in case anyone has any questions. Okay. And I think we're about due for another round of introductions. We have 2 rows left. So second to last row, you're up. We're about due for introductions. So, oh, we obviously did not give you enough candy. So if the second to last row wants to introduce themselves, we're at a good pause point for that. Mm-hmm. Awesome. Yes. Awesome. Let's keep going. One thing we might notice is if we now want to add a new user. So we've added this inline, which is very useful. But now when we try and add a new user, we're having the same or a similar kind of issue to what we saw before, where we have fields here that we don't really need when we're adding a new user. This is a different solution from what we saw before. And this one is actually a little bit, it's similar, so it'll give you a good refresher, but it's a different method. So when you're going through and you want to do custom things in the admin, typically the first thing you'll want to do is look through the reference docs and see if there's a method that you can override that will do what you want. So for example, in this case, there's a method called getFormSets with Inlines that takes our standard request and obj equal none. What it returns typically is a generator that is all of the inline instances for that model admin. I think this method is actually new in 1.7 or 1.8. I don't think it existed before. So it's also interesting from that perspective. But it's the same pattern that we saw before with get field sets, except instead of field sets, we're getting all of the inlines that are defined on this model, and we're modifying them before it's displayed to the user. So here we're looking at each of the inline instances. We're checking whether that instance is, is the loaned book inline. And if we're adding a new user, because we don't want this to show up when we add a new user, and we just continue instead of yielding that inline. When we do this, we go back and we are on the add user page. No longer see the extra inlines. So good pattern to keep in mind once you start getting to more advanced overrides. Now we're going to have some fun with displaying things in the admin. So one of the advantages of the admin is it doesn't just have to be fields that you display. It will also handle methods. And here we're adding a new method called isOverdue, where if the current date is greater than the due date, it's true, otherwise it's false. We want to display this in the admin somewhere, and I would like to use it as a way to demonstrate list display. So list display is a way to see more about your model without having to actually click in to the change form. So before I check out that commit, let's go back and look at what loaned books list view currently looks like. So this is the current list view. You can see our Unicode, which is what it defaults to. So the name of the person who checked out the book and the title of the book. Where we get that from, or where the Django admin gets that from, is this Unicode string that we defined here. If you're using Python 3, then you use __ string str. I think most people are still on 2.7, unless they're starting a brand new project, though. So I have to click through to see much that's useful. List display lets me modify this, so I want to see Unicode, whether it's overdue, and due date. So the first two are methods on the model. The third is a field on the model, and Django knows how to deal with that. You can also specify a method on the model admin itself. So now if we refresh this page, wait for the dev server to fix itself. It says there are no errors. but it's taking it longer and longer to load everything. We get a much nicer view where we have a loaned book, is overdue, false and true, and due date. Some nice things that Django does by default with dates is it automatically knows how to filter on these. So you can sort by which books are due soonest. You can get rid of the ordering. Now, some of you may have noticed on other sites that you've seen that Boolean values display a little red marker or a little green checkbox. But this is displaying true and false. That's because we haven't told Django that this is a Boolean method, but we can. So the next piece in here is we specify that is overdue, the method, is a Boolean. Check this out. And when we refresh, you get the standard Boolean displays. I want to do a little bit more. We're almost through this. I added Django debug toolbar at this point to the app because one of the things that we're going to do before we finish is show you how to debug some common performance issues with the admin that can really show you where you might want to modify things. And before we get to that, I want to look at a way to highlight overdue books. So it's nice that I can see whether or not it's overdue here. If I didn't have this, or maybe I'd like to see the due date highlighted as well. It's easy to do that. I can add a new method called highlighted due date. Define that if something is overdue, I want the background of that field to be red. If it's due in less than 2 days, I want it to be yellow. And otherwise, I want it to return the default due date. And this is in stacks/models.py. And then I modify stacks/admin.py so that due date becomes highlighted due date. Trivial example, you can also grab other elements and do something similar. It's good for small changes. If you're doing something more dramatic to the list view, you may want to, in that case, actually subclass listview.html, or sorry, extend listview. Over there. I can talk, I promise. You may want to override listview.html for that particular app. One thing to note, this doesn't let us click anymore, so we lost that sorting functionality, and the dates are being displayed differently. There are a couple reasons for this. Anyone want to venture a guess? And there's when you define it just as the field due date, or when you just return the due date value without modifying the HTML, Django knows that this is a date field, and in the background does some additional formatting on it to localize it, as well as since it knows that it's a field on the database that is a date field, it will automatically add that for you. If you do customizations like this, you have to remember to add those things back in. And the way that you do that, or one of the ways you can do that, is first, I went through and looked at where Django actually does the formatting. I had to go look at some of the backend code. So never be afraid to do that, to figure out what it was using in order to do the local formatting. So in utils, there's a formats field. And if you use formats.localize, this will return the localized version instead, which is close to what we wanted. So everything looks nice now. Still can't click. The way that we can tell Django that we want to order by a specific field, and this is actually an important point. If you're doing custom methods like this and putting them in the admin, and even if they're not displaying something that's exactly like the fields that you're acting on, you can always do this ordering. So what I'm doing in this line, in stacks/models.py, to modify our loaned book model, is I'm saying that admin order field should be due date, which is the field on the model. Even if I was doing some weird, crazy stuff and spitting out random UUIDs, I could still order by the due date field, which is useful in some circumstances, because it can give your users a sense of time, or if the ordering is different. It's just nice to know that there's no specific relation between the method that you're using and the field that you specify it should be ordered by, if that ever comes in handy. Quick demonstration. Due date. Now I have my filtering back.
Wait, so how did you implement filtering again?
Sorry, sorting.
I'm sorry.
Ordering. So, and I'll go to the full model because it might be a little bit more apparent there. So this is our highlighted due date method. And below it we have allow tags equals true. Otherwise Django will ignore and escape all of the HTML tags. You have to tell it that it's okay to allow HTML so that you're protected against XSS attacks, cross-site scripting. So you only want to allow tags if you have control over the input. So it's okay here because I'm specifying the exact HTML. If this was user inputted, if this was data that a user had input, you wouldn't want to set allow tags equal to true because someone could then use it to hack your backend, potentially. So the ordering is a field that says that this method, the highlighted due date method, should use the due date field for its ordering. And you just specify it as a string. So up here, we have our due date field. If we had specified, like we did before in list display, the exact due date, then it would display this, but without any of the highlighting, right?
What kind of objects? Wait, I'm highlighted due date. It's just a method?
It's just a method on loaned book.
You're doing highlighted due date dot.
So it's just a method on loaned book and highlighted due date dot admin order field.
Due date is the name of the field, the actual field.
Yes.
Okay.
So the due date field is defined here. What Django does is it looks at this it looks at the attribute that you're specifying on this method, sees that this is a field, and exactly how it does this is probably way too advanced for this tutorial. It's not magic. it's just a feature of Python, actually. It's not anything really special about Django, because this is just an ordinary Python class for the most part. You can do this in regular Python classes and play with it.
So that's a class attribute you
Let's go in the group one-on-one time. We can go through that because I don't want to derail too much. But we can play around with it in the shell, and I'll show you in more detail how it works. Because you can look at this like you could grab one of the objects and take a look at exactly what admin order field is, and you'd be able to see it there. Yes? I would need to look at the documentation. I don't remember off the top of my head. I don't think you can. You can specify that you want it to be descending, which is new in Django 1.7, i.e. you can do this. But actually, no. Because of the way that this works, I don't think you can set this in particular to be a method, because what it's looking for is an actual field on the database, so that it can do the default ordering based on that field, if that makes sense. Yeah, using a custom method there wouldn't really make sense. So we change that, then it defaults to being descending instead of ascending, which is new. The other thing I should mention is I often like to specify these on the models, but in some cases it can be more appropriate to specify this on the model admin. You can do that as well. Django will pick it up whether it's specified on the model or on the model admin. So depending on whether you would use, for example, the highlighted due date in other contexts, then you might want to specify it on the model. Otherwise, specifying it on the model admin might make it cleaner for people who don't really care about highlighting a due date. This is the performance-related stuff. Actually, before we do that, I have to go back. So this is, we're getting close to the end of me talking, which I'm sure you're all excited about. So how many of you have worked with Django Debug Toolbar before? Oh, one of you. It's one of the most useful tools ever for debugging performance issues in your admin, particularly when it comes to queries. So it pops out like this. You can see what version of Django you're running, how long this took. It will break it down into what the browser was doing during that time. You can see what all of your current settings values are. Headers, information about the request. This is what we'll talk about in just a sec, because it's key to understanding performance, is it will break down all of the queries that were run for that particular page. Static files, templates, cache, any signals that were sent, any logging. So it can tell you a lot about what your site is doing, and you can use it even on production web servers. So you don't have to be using the dev server to use this. You can use it if you're running Apache or Nginx or anything. Don't use it on public-facing production because you have to turn debug on in order to use it, and you're basically opening up all the information about your site ever, including the version that you're using. So if you're trying to debug production issues using Django Debug Toolbar, and it's something where you need the database, do it on a staging server that's not public-facing, that's behind a VPN, that is firewalled. I don't know how else to put this. Just don't put it on production unless you really want your site to get hacked. So this works with Django 1.4 to 1.8 last time I checked. The information is on their in their docs. So notice that we're running 14 queries to get this information, which seems like kind of a lot, right? Like if we go to, for example, our users, we also have a bunch of information here, but we're only running 5 queries, right? Like we have username, email address, first name, last name, staff. Seems like a lot of information. So you can take a look at what queries are actually being run. It's doing queries on the session, library user, and all of their information, authgroup.id, and it's counting how many users there actually are. If count takes a long time, this is actually new in 1.7 or 1.8. You can specify that you don't want to have everything counted. I have the field, or the, I have the class attribute that you need to set in order to do that written down, but I don't remember off the top of my head. So that's taking 5, whereas loaned books is taking 14 queries. If we look at this, doing the same thing, we get the session, we get select library users.id, where library user.id equals 1. And then down here, we're getting library users underscore library user and all of the information where ID equals 2, ID equals 2. So we're making the same query over and over again for the user and for the books. The reason that this is happening is because these are foreign keys. So if we look back at our loaned book model, which is right here, and we look at our fields, right? We have patron equals models.foreign key, and book equals models.foreign key book. This is our user, and this is our book. And right here, we're specifying that we want the Unicode displayed from self.patron and self.book. What Django does, because it's not magic, it doesn't know any better, because you haven't told it yet, is when we specified that we wanted these fields in the list display, remember? Unicode, every time for every line, it's running the queries it needs to get this Unicode information, and it's not caching it. So it's going to run a query to get all of the patron information and all of the book information for each row. So every time you add a new row, you're going to get a multiplicative increase in queries. So if I added yet another book, and we look at how many queries are run, now it's 16, which is 2 more than before. So for every additional row, you're going to have 2 more queries, which is not ideal, especially if you start showing hundreds of rows and you have lots of fields that you're displaying, and you have a lot of complex relationships. You can even go further and do things like specify due date, underscore, underscore, some other field, and go pretty far down the road in connecting things, which we can get into as an aside later. The solution is this attribute called list select related. There are 2 ways that you can use this. The first is just to set it true. When we do that, we wait for the server to load. There it goes. 4 queries. Vast improvement. I have seen list views running thousands of queries for each view on frequently viewed pages and running up the CPU on the database server like you wouldn't believe. The slight disadvantage of just using, this is kind of like the sledgehammer method of using list select related, and it used to be the only way that you could do it. There is now an alternative, which is list select related and then specifying the exact fields that you want to use. And this will actually show in detail what I mean about how the queries increase. So if we specify that we just want one of those fields, the patron field, which is our user, to be used with select related. Let me back up 1 sec. So how many of you are familiar with select related as a concept at all? Okay. I'll go back just a little bit and explain what it does. So imagine that you are Django's ORM and you are creating queries. One way that you can do this is to grab foreign keys on an as-needed basis and basically grab them every single time that you need to. What select related does is it says, say you were using the ORM and you got loaned book, or the other way around. Let's say you were looking at a particular user, and I'll do this at the command line as an aside just because it might make things clearer. But Django doesn't necessarily know by default that it shouldn't do the query every time that it's looking for a foreign key relationship. So if I do, I think it's 3. That's not the right one. Okay. This is our user that has books checked out. So we can say lu.books.all. The way we defined that many-to-many relationship and the way that we have Unicode defined on loaned book means that when we go through and when Django goes through and generates this Unicode, it's making a separate database query for each book instead of grabbing all of the related books at once. So to try and So we have, I think that's what I wanted, but I'm not. Give me one. That's not quite right. I need to go back and. So if we look at our library users, py books. This is actually stacks.book through loanbook. What I actually wanted was loaned book set. That's why it wasn't doing what I wanted. Okay, so when I look at this, I'm getting the set of all books that this user has checked out, right? What Django does behind the scenes is it generates the Unicode by finding, so it'll do the query to get the loaned book, but it doesn't ahead of time get the name of the library user that's associated with that book or the title of that book, which are specified on the fields that it's related to. What it does instead is it does the query to get this, and then it does an individual query to get the title of each book in that list. Which is what what we were seeing here as well. So if we go back 1 second, you can actually see the queries that it's doing. So each of these 16 queries, we get the library user. And then as we're going down, we get the individual library user so that we can display the name. And then we get the book so that we can display the title. And then we get the library user again so that we can display the name. And we get the book so that we can display the title. Then we get the library user again so that we can display the name. And we get the book so that we can display the title. When we say that we're going to use list select related equals true, we do one query here that gets all of the information on the library users and on the books using 2 inner joins. And then Django doesn't have to redo it every single time. So 4 queries instead of 16. If you multiply out by, say you were displaying hundreds of loaned books and had lots of columns, you can see how this becomes very useful very quickly. To make apparent what happens when you're doing select related on just one of the related fields, it did 10 queries instead, because what we told it to do was get the related user object so that we don't have to keep regenerating that name, but we didn't tell it to get the related book object, so it's going to end up getting the title of that book every time. So you can see getting the book so that we can get the title, sorry, here, getting the book just so that we can use that title, book just so that we can use that title, book just so that we can use that title, book just so that we can use that title. As an aside, if you really have performance issues on your admin website and you don't want to create a custom admin, there is a way that you can create a custom query set for your list view. And then say, for example, borrowing period is a bad example, but say we had the full text of the book as one of our fields, and you notice Django by default grabs all of the fields, even though it's only using title. If you have very large fields, that can cause things to be slow. So in some cases that you would find out about by using an analysis like this, to look at the queries that are being generated, you could use methods on the ORM like only, which will allow you to specify that you only want to retrieve the fields that you need, as opposed to doing the default behavior, which is to retrieve everything. Make sense? Possibly not, but it will make sense eventually, I promise. The more you play with Django, the more it will make sense. And if you build a big site, you'll start seeing stuff like this really quickly, and you'll think back, and you'll be like, oh, there was this thing that I could do. Here, this is doing the same thing as list select related equals true, except we're manually specifying the fields. The reason that you might not want to use list select related equal true is if you have a lot of interconnected models. It will follow the joins as far as they go, which may not be what you want. So I switched it back to true here. Just a few more things that I thought were interesting to point out. Another piece that's interesting is you can specify that certain fields are read-only in the admin. For example, say we wanted to specify that call number should be a read-only field. If we go back and look at our books, and select the book, hide that. Call number, you can't edit it anymore. So whatever it is when it's created, it's stuck there. The problem with this, of course, is that if I wanted to add another book, author, and we'll leave everything else default. If I save, I had no way to edit it. I think the server failed to restart because that should not have worked. Yeah, the server hadn't restarted yet. What should happen is, since call number is a required field and there's no default, it should have failed validation. We'll skip that. All right. This was one that I added at the last minute to be an example. Fail. So in our model here, call number. Okay, let's try that again. that error is happening because I have to look at why that's. Oh. We'll skip exactly why that's not failing. I'll take a look at it later so we don't hold this up. But generally speaking, if you had something like a date field and you made it read-only, but it was required, you would run into issues because you have no way to set it. The next piece that I wanted to show is a bit of a more advanced example where, just like before, say we had read-only fields on the call number, and we want anyone to be able to edit this field if it's a new book, and then if they're an employed librarian, they can edit it. Otherwise, it's still a read-only field. I'll show you what this looks like. So I'm a super user, which means now, for me, this call number is editable. So I'll change that to be, say, 8, 9. Instead, I can change that. If I log out, you'll see that behind the scenes, I created 2 groups, one which is called employed librarians, one that's called volunteer librarians, because for whatever reason I want volunteer librarians to not be able to edit call numbers. If I log in as the volunteer, yes. There we go. Then if I go back to books, then for me, this isn't editable. So this will be the last thing we go over before kind of break up and start playing around with things. This is following the same pattern that we've seen for overriding methods all throughout this tutorial. We have get something, we have a request, and we have an obj. The thing that's different in this particular override is in all of our previous ones, we didn't use request, right? We just let it do its thing. What we're doing here is we're getting the read-only fields that are being set on the parent class. So super bookadmin self.get read-only fields request obj. We check whether or not we're creating a new book, and then we let anyone edit that. We return read-only fields. And that's just, we're just going to use the default that the parent class uses. Otherwise, if we're part of if the logged in user, so request.user is telling us who that logged in user is in this employed librarians group, they can do whatever they want. So it's still editable because we don't have any other read-only fields. Otherwise, we're going to return read-only fields plus call number. So for non-employed librarians, the read-only fields are whatever the previously defined read-only fields were, plus the call number. Perhaps one other example might make this more apparent. So if we go in here and we look at stacks/admin.py and look at read-only fields equal, say we add another one like daily fine is read-only for, is read-only for everyone. Daily fine is now read-only for me. I'm a non-employed librarian. If I log back in as the admin, and go back to any of the books, I scroll down and I can see that call number is not read-only because I'm in the employed librarians group, but daily fine is still read-only because I set it that way here. So this get read-only fields is taking all of the read-only file fields that you defined here and adding to them in some cases or leaving them as they were in others. Clear as mud? I think we're at the limit of what everyone can process by me just standing here and talking. What I'd like everyone to do now is maybe stand up and stretch a little bit. I'd like you all to find the Django admin reference doc. And does everyone have the project set up in a way that they're able to work on it themselves? Does anyone not? Okay, we'll help you out. Or you can work with someone who has it working. What we're going to do is I'm going to post some example exercises. These are some exercise ideas that we have available to us. And this is so these are some various exercise ideas. I'll classify them as simple or easy, or simple or more advanced. For the simpler side of things, what would be most helpful for a lot of people is to go to the Django docs, and we're going to scroll down to where we have model admin options. And I'll point out a few of these that are more straightforward. So for example, a good place to start might be date hierarchy, which you can set on the model admin, and what it'll do is automatically allow you to filter based on the date hierarchy. Exclude we talked about, fields we talked about. Some other straightforward ones are list editable, list filter. So this will give you some good practice. So for example, These are all more advanced. The things that are more straightforward are the ones that are listed in the admin site. And I have one other reference document that has a list of beginner fields. Got this. Page list later. Okay. I wish this is something that I would have made as a paper handout, but this is more along the lines of easy fields. So admin order fields, the Boolean attribute, list display links, list editable, list filter, list max show all, list per page. Almost everything that has list in it is generally on the easier side. Search fields are also something that is very useful. So if you're thinking of something to work on and you need something on the easier side, I would suggest going with list max show all, list per page, or search field and playing around with those. If you're looking for something more advanced, pick something from this list. Take a look at it. So at this point, I would like to have our back row introduce themselves, and then I'll start going around to different groups. You can figure out if you want to work with people around you or work on something yourself. I'll try and make it to everyone in the room before we leave. So, back row. Mine too.
This guy's all about, I took this one to.
Knock on my doors.
All right, so 2 final sort of bookkeeping notes. Thank you. I put some business cards there. If you want to get a hold of me afterwards, please feel free. It has my work email on there. My personal email is just firstname.lastname@gmail.com, and that's a better place to reach me for things like this. Lastly, there is a post-tutorial survey. if you write this down, I'll leave the examples up while I'm walking around. It's case sensitive as well. So it's in capital S D Q A Y. Does anyone have any questions before we break up and start working on things individually? Also, I'm happy to stay past the official end time of the tutorial and work with anyone who has more questions. Yes? Oh, my name at gmail.com. So jacinda.shelly@gmail.com. Feel free to reach out. I can be slow to respond to email on occasion, but I never get offended if people email me multiple times. I try to respond quickly. With that, I think we're done with the presentation part, unless anyone has any last alibis. Thank you so much for attending. I'm happy to help anyone with anything they're interested in working on.